What happens when a player has everything it takes to be a legend, but in a single night he sees his empire crumble? Do you remember him? The striker who terrorized defenses, who wore the Brazilian team's shirt as if it were made for him, who carried the gift of deciding matches in his feet. He was the new king of football, the promise that would make history, the name that was destined to be remembered forever. But then, everything changed. The shine, the spotlight, the titles, the glories disappeared in a way that no one expected. Football has seen promises that didn't come to fruition, stars that lost their way, but this story is different. We're not talking about someone who just didn't work out. This is the case with Adrian Imperator, a monster on the field, a striker who was once considered unstoppable, a player who had the world at his feet. And suddenly he disappeared. What happened? How did someone with so much talent fall so quickly? Could it have been the weight of fame? Problems off the field? Or is there an even darker truth behind this fall? Many talk about young promises who never reach the top, but few cases are as impactful as this. He wasn't just a promise, he was already at the top. And even so, he couldn't hold on to the crown. Its decline was brutal, unexpected, and to this day it generates debate. How could a player so strong, so talented, so ready to dominate the world of football have lost everything practically overnight? The answer isn't that simple, and as we reveal the behind-the-scenes story, you'll realize that this isn't just another rise and fall story. It's a true sporting tragedy. But before we go deeper into this trajectory, I want to know, do you believe that talent is enough to keep a player at the top? Or is football a much bigger game, where psychological factors, off-field decisions, and even fate can end promising careers? Leave your opinion in the comments, because what we're going to reveal here could completely change the way you see this player. Now, get ready, because the truth behind this fall is more shocking than you imagine, since this story has shocked you so far. Imagine what is yet to come. Leave a like, because this case will become even more unbelievable. He was born in Brazil, a country where football is not just a sport, but a dream that defines destinies. Since he was little, he attracted attention. While other boys kicked balls barefoot through the streets of favelas and dirt fields, he did it with a talent that seemed out of this world. Anyone who saw him play knew he wasn't just another player. He didn't just dominate the ball, he made it obey his command. With every dribble, with every shot, it was clear he was different. This boy grew up with a single goal: to become one of the greatest football players in history. And the world believed he could do it. The journey began like so many other Brazilian football promises. A humble boy from simple origins, fighting to transform his talent into a better future. But unlike many, he didn't just stick to his promise. From his first appearances on professional football, it was clear that something special was happening. He didn't just play to win, he played to destroy opponents, to challenge entire defenses, to leave his mark. Quickly, his name began to be spoken by scouts, commentators, and fans. He was strong, fast, relentless, and most impressively, decisive. He didn't need many opportunities to score goals. All it took was one chance, a minimum of space, and he made the net swing. Flamengo was the first great showcase for his talent. The club that revealed legends like Zico and Junior now had new hope at the feet of that young man. Its impact was immediate. Fans idolized him, opponents feared facing him. The red and black fans knew they were facing a star. But it was outside Brazil that his name really began to resonate among the giants of world football. The overwhelming performances caught the attention of Inter Milan, one of the most powerful clubs in Europe. And so, before even turning 20, he set sail for the old continent to become a global star. In Italy, it didn't take long for him to show the world who he really was. His debut was marked by a goal that left everyone in shock. In a friendly against Real Madrid, he took a free kick from so far away that it seemed impossible to result in anything. but the ball exploded in the air like a missile and ended up in the back of the net. The entire stadium was silent for a second, before erupting in applause. Who was that boy? How could someone with so little experience do something like that? The answer lay in what he always had: natural talent combined with impressive strength. He wasn't just another technical player. He had power, explosiveness, almost absurd precision with his kicks. Newspapers began to make bold comparisons. Some said he was the successor to Ronaldo Fenomeno. Others claimed that his playing style was a mix of Romario and Zlatan Ibrahimovic. At Inter Milan, he became the Emperor, and that nickname made perfect sense. On the field, he dominated. There was no defense that could stop him. His physical size, his speed, his coolness in front of goal. He had all the characteristics of a perfect striker. While other promising young players took years to adapt to European football, he arrived, destroying records, winning games, and making the Italian fans fall in love. The rise was meteoric. He wasn't just one of the best strikers in Europe, he was one of the best in the world. Goals from outside the box, unstoppable runs, plays that defied any logic in football. It seemed like he had no limits. With the Brazilian national team shirt, he was even more dominant. In the 2004 Copa America, he simply destroyed any doubts about his potential. In the final against Argentina, with Brazil losing 2-1, he scored a stoppage time goal that looked like something out of a movie script. In the last play of the game, with the ball remaining in the area, he spun and shot the goalkeeper. The stadium exploded. Brazil exploded. Football had found its new monster. That was the moment when everyone believed he would be unbeatable for years. He had already exceeded all expectations. What could stop him? At just 22 years old, he was on top of the world. Inter Milan depended on him. The Brazilian team trusted him. The fans saw him as the new hope of football, and he knew it. But while everyone saw a young man destined to be one of the greatest players in history, there was something few realized. That same shine that made him a star also hid something dark. The pressure was building. Expectations were becoming a burden. And behind the goals, the victories, and the celebrations, something was happening. The signs were subtle at first. Small changes in behavior, some unexplained absences, moments when he seemed distant, even on the field. But no one wanted to believe that anything could go wrong. How could I? He was unstoppable. He was the emperor. But football is relentless. And when the fall began, no one could stop it. He had everything, but a single night would change his story forever. Now, the question was no longer about what he could achieve. The question was, how could someone so strong, so dominant, so prepared to be a legend, lose everything in the blink of an eye? The answer to that question is what makes this story one of the most tragic in modern football. And that's exactly what we're going to reveal now. He was at his peak. No defense could stop him. No goalkeeper seemed capable of stopping his shots. The ball seemed to look for his feet, and when it arrived, the destination was always the same: the back of the net. He was the new reference in world football, the player who carried with him the weight of an empire. The Emperor. The fans sang his name, his teammates trusted him as a great leader, and the press was full of praise. He was compared to the greatest strikers in history, and no one dared disagree. For many, he was poised to dominate world football for the next few years, perhaps even a decade. But behind the scenes, a shadow was beginning to grow, and like a silent storm, no one realized the worst was yet to come. Football can be a paradise for those at the top, but it can also be hell when everything starts to fall apart. The same people who applaud a player one day can be the first to turn their backs when things don't go well. And in his case, the signs were emerging but ignored. The goals were still coming, the victories were still coming, but something was different. Those who knew him closely noticed that behind the strength, the explosion, the coolness in front of the goal, something wasn't right. His eyes no longer shined as before. His posture seemed heavier, and training began to be a burden. To the fans, he was still the emperor. For those inside the club, concern began to grow. Then came the fatal blow, the news that would change everything. A phone call. His father, the man who had always been his safe haven, the foundation of his entire journey, had passed away. The world of an elite athlete demands absolute mental strength. But how can we maintain this strength when the foundation of everything crumbles? He tried to follow. He tried to ignore the pain. He tried to pretend that he could continue to be the same player, that he could carry the same intensity, the same passion, the same determination. But the truth was that something inside him had broken. From that moment on, everything changed. Training began to seem unbearable. Travel was torture. Games became a burden. He no longer saw any point in being there. His body was still that of an unbeatable athlete, but his mind was no longer on football. The board noticed. His teammates understood, but no one knew what to do. He was still young. He still had a long way to go. It was just a phase, they said. But some phases never pass. The nights started to get longer. The streets of Brazil seemed to call his name with more force than the packed stadiums of Europe. He began to return more frequently to his homeland, looking for something that even he didn't know exactly what it was. Maybe a refuge, perhaps a way to escape the suffocating pressure of European football. But the further he got away from the field, the harder it was to return. Football required maximum dedication, absolute discipline, and he no longer wanted to submit to that. Delays in training began to become frequent. The newspapers began to speculate. What was happening to the emperor? Why wasn't he the same anymore? The first headlines about his downfall began to emerge. Some said he was lost, that he no longer had the same hunger as before. Others believed he was dealing with something much bigger than football. But the truth is that he no longer knew if he wanted to continue. Inter Milan was trying to find a solution. The club knew they had one of the most talented players of their generation on their hands, but they also realized that the battle he was facing was not against defenders or goalkeepers, but against himself. Then came the decision. He needed time, a break to reorganize your mind, to find yourself again. But in football, time is cruel. Football doesn't wait. While one player is absent, another appears. And when he realized it, he had already lost space. When he finally returned, something was different. He was still strong, he still had the same physical presence, but he no longer had the same will. His love for football seemed to have faded. He played because he was still good at it, but not because he wanted to be there. Training was just an obligation. The matches were just another day at work. The Emperor's glow was fading, and everyone was noticing. Then came the night that changed everything. The night that would become the symbol of his downfall. A night of excess, of wrong choices, of a path of no return. The newspapers made headlines the next day. Photos were leaked. Rumors arose. He was no longer an elite athlete. It was no longer the same promise. The Emperor, who once seemed invincible, now became a doubt. The club tried to rescue him. He tried to offer new opportunities, but football doesn't forgive. The manager's patience ran out. The crowd started to question, and then the decision was made. The cycle at Inter Milan has come to an end. He would return to Brazil, but not as the emperor who conquered Europe. I would return as a player trying to recover something that, deep down, was already lost. The question now was no longer about his talent. That was never in doubt. The question was, did he still want to be a football player? Did he still have the strength to fight everything that haunted him? What happened next was a sequence of attempts and failures, of new beginnings that never materialized. He went from an undisputed idol to an unknown quantity. And as Europe's doors closed, opportunities in Brazil also began to disappear. But this story is not over yet, because what came after was even more impactful, even more unbelievable. If you thought this trajectory had already reached its lowest point, wait until you see what happened next. He was back in Brazil, but something was different. He was no longer the same player who terrorized European defenses. He was no longer the relentless emperor who decided games with a devastating shot. His return seemed, to many, the perfect chance for a fresh start. After all, how many players leave European football and find a second chance to shine in Brazil? But with him, history would take a different turn. What was supposed to be a redemption ended up becoming the darkest chapter of his career. The talent was still there, the physique was still impressive, but his mentality was no longer the same. He had left Europe, but the ghosts that haunted him came with him. The welcome was warm. The fans embraced him like a prodigal son. He wore the shirt of one of the biggest clubs in Brazil, and the packed stadiums sang his name again. But unlike the first time, something felt out of place. His first games were a mix of nostalgia and frustration. There were glimpses of the star who once dominated football, moments when it seemed like everything would go back to the way it was before. But soon after came lackluster performances, games where he seemed absent, as if he were physically on the field, but mentally distant. The trainers were trying to rescue him. The club did everything it could to help him reconnect with football. But the problem wasn't on the pitch, it was outside of them. He started missing training. Small delays have become routine. Stories of late nights began to spread. Photos were leaked. Reports that he preferred parties to training began to emerge. At first, they tried to minimize the situation. He's readapting, they said. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. The player who once dominated Europe now struggled to find the motivation to train. Brazilian football, with its intensity and pressure, is not an easy place for anyone who is not 100% committed. He started to lose space. Young talents began to emerge, and little by little, playing time began to decrease. The fans, who at first treated him like a hero returning home, began to divide. Some still believed he could regain his shine. Others already saw him as a player in irreversible decline. But what no one expected was that the fall was far from over. The first injuries began to appear. His physique, once one of his greatest weapons, began to show signs of wear. It wasn't as fast anymore. It didn't have the same explosion. Football demands discipline, it demands sacrifice, and he no longer seemed willing to pay that price. But even so, the clubs continued to give chances. His name still carried weight. He was still a living football legend. Then, new opportunities emerged. Each new team represented a new hope for redemption. But the cycle repeated itself. It started well, full of promises and expectations. But soon the old habits returned. Absences in training, loss of motivation, problems off the field. Clubs began to lose patience. Contracts that could have lasted years were interrupted prematurely. He still didn't accept that he was in decline, but football had already made its choice. The game went on, with or without him. The media began to change their tune. Before, they spoke of it as a phenomenon that needed time. Now the comments were different. He doesn't want to play anymore, they said. Lost the will. Headlines began circulating, listing all the opportunities he squandered. He went from being a promise of Brazilian football to an example of what not to do. And yet, his story would not end there, because what happened next was even more unbelievable. If you thought the fall had already reached rock bottom, wait until you see what happened next. The world of football has witnessed great falls throughout history, but few were as impactful and difficult to understand as that of Adriano Imperator. How did one of the most feared attackers in the world get to the point of losing everything? The talent was still there. His physical strength, his shooting accuracy, his fans' respect. All of this still made him an elite player. But there was something that football didn't see, something that neither the coaches, nor the managers, nor even the fans could fully see. Adriano was no longer the same. Since his father's death, his mentality on and off the field began to change. Training started to feel like a burden. The passion that had driven him before seemed exhausted. Inter Milan were still trying to keep him, still betting on him, but they knew they were losing their biggest star. The club did everything it could to keep him motivated. Psychological support, individual conversations, adjustments to his training routine. But nothing seemed to work. The problem began to grow behind the scenes. Absences from training became frequent. First there were delays, then justified absences. Soon, the board realized that they could no longer predict whether Adriano would show up to train or not. For fans, he was still an idol. For managers, it was an increasingly bigger problem. European football requires absolute discipline, and any deviation from the rules is usually severely punished. But with Adriano, Inter tried a different approach. They knew they were dealing with a special player, and they wanted to do everything they could to avoid losing him. But then, the night that would change everything happened. What should have been just a moment of leisure ended up becoming the trigger for his downfall in Europe. In 2006, after a game for Inter, Adriano disappeared. He didn't warn anyone. He didn't show up for training the next day. Didn't answer calls. When he finally returned to the club, he seemed distant, out of shape, and without the sparkle in his eyes that once enchanted the world of football. At that same time, photos were leaked to the Italian press showing Adriano at parties, surrounded by drinks and friends, in a completely different state than what was expected of a high-level athlete. It was a brutal contrast to the player who, just a few years earlier, destroyed defenses and was considered the future of Brazilian football. Inter tried to cover up the scandal, but it was impossible. The press was all over the case, questioning his dedication to football. TV shows began speculating about his life off the field. Experts discussed whether he could still be one of the greatest strikers of his generation or whether he was already in free fall. And fans began to divide opinions. That's when the headline appeared that shocked the world. "The Emperor is lost." The phrase appeared on the covers of newspapers in Italy and Brazil. The press no longer treated him as a football genius, but as a player in decline. The same journalists who previously compared him to Ronaldo Fenomeno were now discussing whether his career was coming to an end. Inter Milan's directors knew they were facing a difficult decision. They still believed in Adriano's talent, but their patience was running out. Internally, the club was already discussing a possible departure. They tried to talk to him. They tried to find solutions. But Adriano didn't seem willing to change. Training continued to be a problem. Sometimes he arrived late. Others didn't even show up. His relationship with the coaching staff began to deteriorate, and then the decision came. Inter Milan announced that Adriano would be removed from the first team. He still had a contract, but he would no longer play. It was the first big blow in his career. Adriano did not contest the decision. He could have fought to prove he was still the same devastating striker. He could have committed to regaining form and regaining the club's trust. But he didn't. He just accepted his departure, as if he already knew that his era in Europe was coming to an end. After that, Inter even tried to reinstate him. At times, it looked like he might be the dominant player he once was, but flashes of genius were rare. When he got on the field, he was still able to make incredible plays, but his mentality was no longer that of a player obsessed with victory. Something inside him had already changed forever. European football, relentless as ever, would not wait for him. Inter knew they needed to move on. The club began looking for alternatives on the market, and within a short time, came to the conclusion that Adriano was no longer part of the team's future. His contract would not be renewed. When the news spread, the football world was in shock. How was it possible that one of the most talented players on the planet was leaving through the back door? How could such a strong, decisive attacker simply lose space without fighting to regain his place? But for Adriano, the answer was simple. He was tired. Tired of European football. Tired of the pressure. Tired of the charges. He wanted to go home, and that's what he did. Shortly after being removed from Inter Milan, Adriano decided to return to Brazil. He believed that by returning to his roots, he could find joy in football again. At Flamengo, the club that revealed him, he would have the chance to start again. It would be his redemption, his opportunity to prove that he still had a lot to offer the sport. But as the world would discover, this attempt at a fresh start would not go as expected. Because instead of finding his passion for football again, Adriano would sink even further. Returning to Brazil would bring new challenges, new controversies, and in the end, it would be the final blow to his career. From that moment on, the fall of the emperor would become irreversible. Football, which had once placed him at the top of the world, now left him behind. And what happened next would prove that sometimes talent isn't enough to save a career. But the big question was, would a last start be possible? Or was Adriano's era in football already completely buried? If he still had any chance to rewrite his story, this was the moment to seize it. What happened next would leave the football world speechless. Time passed, and he seemed increasingly distant from football. Not just on the pitch, but on the very idea of being a professional player. While his former teammates continued to shine, accumulating titles, playing in World Cups, writing their names in history, he was no longer part of that conversation. His name was still mentioned, but not for his achievements on the field. The narrative around him had changed. Now he was an example of what could have been, a reminder of how cruel football can be to those who, for whatever reason, lose control. But did he really care? Could it be that, seeing his contemporaries lifting trophies and breaking records, he felt regret? The answer for many was difficult to understand. He didn't seem to carry any remorse. For him, his story had gone exactly as it should. But for football, it was as if an empire had been destroyed before reaching its true peak. Still, however much he moved away from top-level football, the sport never completely moved away from him. His name still sold headlines, still generated debates, still aroused the public's curiosity. With each appearance, with each new interview, the same question arose. Why did he leave everything behind? He never gave a definitive answer. Sometimes he talked about tiredness, about the unbearable pressure of being an idol. Other times, he simply said that he had lost the pleasure of playing. But one thing was certain. He never tried to force a real comeback. Unlike other players who, after sudden falls, sought new beginnings, he accepted his destiny and continued living in his own way. Rescue attempts came in many forms. Some clubs still believed they could get him back, that perhaps one last chance in a more controlled environment could rekindle the spark. But with each new opportunity, the same cycle repeated itself. Contract signed, initial enthusiasm, irregular training, lack of commitment, and in the end, a silent farewell. It seemed clear that, for him, football was no longer a priority. But then came the most controversial phase of his life. If before his relationship with football was already fragile, now it was about to break forever. Parties became more frequent. News about his nights out began to overtake any mention of his playing past. Catches with friends, late nights full of excesses, events that had nothing to do with sport began to dominate the newspapers. He had become an almost folkloric figure, someone who was remembered more for his stories off the field than for the goals that once marked his career. The fans who once idolized him were now divided between those who mourned his downfall and those who had simply moved on. Football has a short memory, and it was getting closer to being just a distant memory. But what really shocked everyone was how he, little by little, began to disappear completely from the sporting scene. Not just as a player, but as any figure linked to football. Unlike other athletes who, even after retirement, remain involved with the sport as commentators, coaches, or managers, he simply disappeared. There were no plans to pursue football any other way. There were no interviews discussing his career. He didn't try to justify his decisions. He just took a different path, a path no one expected him to take. This created a mystery. Where was he? What did you do? How did you live? Social media started to be the only way to know about your life. And what was seen was not what fans imagined from a former player who was once at the top of the world. Instead of being involved in sporting projects, instead of trying to maintain an image linked to football, he was leading a life completely outside that universe. Travel, leisure time, friendships far from the sporting world. It was as if he wanted to erase any trace that he had once been one of the most feared attackers on the planet. But did that really make him happy? This is the question that many still ask. Because as much as he always insisted that he chose this path, the images that emerged from time to time showed something different. Empty looks, expressions that seemed to reflect something unsaid. People close to him said he missed football, but that it was too late to return. He never admitted this publicly, but for those who followed his career closely, it was difficult not to notice. At this point, his fall was already definitive. There were no more chances of a return. There was no more speculation about a possible restart. He was no longer a player in decline. He was a former player, someone who, through his own choices or life circumstances, had left behind everything he could have been. But still, his story would not end there, because what would come later would still surprise everyone. If you think you've seen the worst of this story, wait and see what happened next. At that point, he was no longer part of football, but football still couldn't forget him. His name always appeared in comparisons, in discussions about wasted talents, in lists of players who had everything to become legends, but who, for some reason, simply didn't get there. The average fan looked at his career and wondered how someone who had everything, fame, money, talent, the idolatry of millions, could just let it all slip away without a fight. But did he really not fight? Or was his battle fought away from the field, away from the public eye, against opponents no one could see? The pressure of being an idol, the weight of carrying impossible expectations, the pain of personal loss, all accumulated over the years, may have been more difficult to deal with than any fierce defender or unbeatable goalkeeper. He was not defeated on the field, but off it. Even away from the spotlight, his presence was still strong. He no longer played, he was no longer in the stadiums, but his name continued to echo. Some tried to rescue his image, arguing that he was a misunderstood genius, a talent crushed by the brutality of modern football. Others said that he was a victim of his own choices, that he had every opportunity in the world to resume his career, but never really wanted to. The debate never reached a consensus. Each one interpreted his story in a different way, but everyone agreed on one thing. He could have been one of the greatest in history, and that was an unquestionable fact. But while the football world was still debating his trajectory, he seemed indifferent. He didn't give interviews, he didn't make a point of justifying his choices. He lived his life the way he wanted, without worrying about public opinion. While many former players did everything they could to stay in the media, he did exactly the opposite. It disappeared for months, sometimes years, without showing any signs of life. When it reappeared, it was almost always unexpectedly. A photo here, a video there, random moments that showed that he still existed, but he no longer wanted to be part of that universe that was once his. There were times when some fans believed he might attempt one last comeback. Rumors arose, news spread the possibility that he would play again, even if it was just for a farewell game worthy of his history. But these rumors never came to fruition. He never showed any real interest in returning. He had already accepted that his career was over, and he saw no need to try to revive something that, for him, was already in the past. Meanwhile, the football world moved on, as it always does. New promises emerged. New idols took the spotlight. The space that was once his now belonged to another generation. But, contrary to what many imagine, his story did not end there. Even away from football, he was still a figure present in popular culture. His name was still remembered in songs, in memes, in bar conversations about players who had everything but didn't work out. He became a symbol not only of wasted talent, but also of a lifestyle that few people could understand. Many looked at his trajectory and saw failure. But did he see it that way? Could it be that, for him, giving up football meant losing? Or could it be that, upon leaving this world of pressure, expectations, and demands, he felt freer than ever? The answer to this question may never be completely clear, but what came next left many shocked. Because just when everyone thought his story had already been completely written, he appeared again. Not in the way many imagined. Not as a player trying for one last opportunity, or as a former athlete looking for a new role in football. His return was unexpected, mysterious, and, like everything in his life, surrounded by controversy. If you thought you already knew the whole story, get ready. Because what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Football is a game of glory, but also of falls. And few players have fallen as dramatically as Adriano Imperator. The striker who was once Brazil's greatest hope for dominating world football was now far from the European spotlight. His departure from Inter Milan came as a shock to everyone. How was it possible that such a talented player was leaving one of the biggest clubs in the world without fighting for his place? The truth was harsh. Adriano didn't want to be there anymore. In the eyes of the world, his return to Brazil seemed to be a golden opportunity to start over. The idea of seeing the Emperor wearing the Flamengo shirt again, the club that introduced him to football, rekindled the fans' hope. They believed that returning home would help him regain his shine, that the weight of Europe had been too much for him, and that now, free from excessive demands, he could be reborn. But no one imagined that, in fact, this would be the darkest chapter of his career. When Adriano landed in Brazil, he was received like a true king. Flamengo fans treated him like a hero who had finally returned home. At his presentation, the stadium was full. Flags, banners, songs. It was as if this was the beginning of a new era. Adriano Imperator was back, and now he would have the chance to rewrite his history. In the first few months, it seemed like the bet had paid off. He still had talent. He could still decide games with a single touch of the ball. But there was something different. That sparkle in his eyes, that desire to be the best, was no longer there. Discipline was never Adriano's strong point, and in Brazil this became even more evident. At Flamengo, he was surrounded by friends, family, everything he missed in Europe. But along with this, old temptations also came. Parties began to become frequent. Training became a problem. In the beginning, there was a delay here and there. Then, there were unjustified absences. The board began to worry. Flamengo's patience began to be tested. The club wanted Adriano on the field, but needed him to commit. He could still score goals. He still showed glimpses of the playmaker who once terrorized defenses in Europe. But increasingly, these moments became rare. Then, a new problem came. The injuries started to appear. His once unbeatable physique now showed signs of wear. Without the necessary discipline and training, without the care required to maintain himself at the highest level, he began to get injured more frequently. His body no longer responded in the same way. His explosiveness, his speed, his ability to decide games, all of this was diminishing. The press began to change its tone. If before there was excitement about his return, now the headlines were different. Does Adriano still have a future in football? Is the Emperor out of shape? Adriano is gone again. And then came the first fatal blow, the termination with Flamengo. The club, which initially bet all its chips on his return, realized that there was no longer any way to hold him back. The Adriano who returned was not the same one who left. The team moved on. He once again fell behind, but he hasn't given up yet. Other clubs in Brazil tried to give him another chance. In Sao Paulo, he tried a new beginning, but the cycle repeated itself. Lack of commitment, physical difficulties, and problems off the field. By this point, his career was no longer just declining, it was falling apart. Even after so many opportunities, Adriano still found more open doors. At Corinthians, he had a new chance to shine. But again, the same pattern repeated itself. He even managed occasional moments of brilliance, like the decisive goal that helped the club win the 2011 Brazilian Championship. But that was just a flash in an already directionless trajectory. His last years in football were marked by frustrated attempts to start over. Each new club represented a new hope, but the result was always the same. It started with expectations, but soon came the absences, the injuries, the lack of discipline. It was as if Adriano himself no longer believed he could return to the top. Over time, the invitations began to disappear. The clubs realized that there was no way to get him back, and slowly and silently, Adriano Imperator stopped being a football player. There was no official farewell. There was no last game to mark the end of his career. He simply disappeared from the field. What was once one of the biggest promises in world football was now just a name mentioned in debates about wasted talent. The fans who once idolized him were now divided. Some still believed he could turn things around, that there was still time for one last big moment. Others, however, had already accepted reality. The Hadrian Emperor who once enchanted the world no longer existed. His name, previously in the headlines for his achievements on the field, now appeared for very different reasons. The press no longer talked about decisive goals or brilliant performances, but rather about his retirement from football, his endless parties, his personal difficulties. Adriano was becoming a tragic character, a cruel reminder that talent is not always enough. And then, without fanfare, without a grand farewell, he simply disappeared. The emperor, who once dominated European fields, was now just a distant memory. But his story wasn't over yet, because what came next was even more surprising. When everyone thought Adriano had disappeared for good, he reappeared in a completely unexpected way. And what happened next took the football world by surprise. The unexpected has always been present in his career. From his first steps into football, he contradicted predictions, defied statistics, and left experts speechless. But in recent years, what was surprising was no longer his plays on the field, his impressive goals, or his unstoppable runs. What was shocking now was the mystery surrounding his life, the way he seemed to simply not care what the world thought of him. Time had passed, and with it came new stars, new promises, new idols who took over the space that was once his. Football moved on, as it always does, but his name never completely disappeared. He was still remembered, but not as an active star. His name became associated with stories of lost glories, of careers that could have been legendary, but that, for some reason, didn't reach the top. But then, without warning, he appeared again. And this time, in a way that no one expected. His face appeared in images that quickly spread across the internet, arousing a mixture of surprise and nostalgia among fans. He was different. Time had left its mark, and that imposing physique that once made him a machine on the field now seemed distant. But what caught the most attention was not his appearance, but where he was. He did not reappear in a stadium. He was not involved in any football-related initiative. There was no return announcement, no mention of future projects in the sport. On the contrary, he seemed to be in a completely different universe, disconnected from everything that once made him a worldwide phenomenon. The images were disconcerting. Many wondered if he was really okay, if this was the life he wanted, if deep down there was regret in his eyes. But he never talked about it. He never explained his decisions, never gave detailed interviews about his downfall. If the world wanted answers, it would have to look for them alone, because he didn't seem interested in explaining. For some, he was just living the way he always wanted, without obligations, without commitments, without having to worry about training, pressure, results. For others, it was a sad portrait of a talent that was wasted, a cruel reminder that not everyone can handle fame and the weight of expectations. The reactions were intense. The public was divided. Some defended him, saying he had the right to live as he wanted, that no one should judge him for his choices. Others expressed frustration, lamenting what could have been one of the greatest careers in football history. But in the end, the truth is that no one really knew what was going on inside him. No one knew if he looked back with regret, or if he was at peace with everything that had happened. But somehow, that unexpected resurgence caused his story to be debated everywhere again. Sports programs started talking about him again. Social networks were flooded with videos recalling his best moments, his unbelievable plays, his goals that seemed to defy physics. His name, which had been in the background for a while, was now in the spotlight again. But not because he had done something on the field. And yes, because everyone wanted to understand how someone who was once one of the most feared players in the world now seemed to be just a distant memory of a glorious past. Then came the speculation. Could he still come back? Could it be that on some level he missed football? Was it all just a phase? And would he soon reappear with a new purpose? Perhaps training young talents, perhaps helping to form a new generation of stars? But the silence continued. No answers, no clues, no indication that he wanted to be back in this world. The mystery surrounding him only increased, and the more people searched for answers, the more they seemed to realize that they might never have them. But what no one expected was that, amid all this scenario, a new event would bring his name back to the headlines. Something that would take everyone by surprise. Something that would make the public question even more whether the story had really come to an end. If you thought everything had already been said, wait until you find out what happened next. History seemed to have reached a point of no return. He had disappeared from the pitch, from the sports news, and for a time, even from the fans' memories. Football followed its natural cycle, as it always does, filling the space that was once its with new stars, new promises, new idols who became the faces of the new generation. But from time to time, his name would resurface, like an echo of a glorious past that was never completely forgotten. And then, when everyone had already accepted that this was the final fate of a player who could have been one of the greatest, something unexpected happened. It all started with a little rumor, something that in another context might not even attract so much attention. But when it comes to someone who has already dominated football, any small movement becomes news. Some said he was thinking about returning, that after years away, perhaps he was missing what once made him a legend. Others stated that it was nothing more than speculation, that he would never step on the field again, that his cycle as an athlete was definitively over. The truth, nobody knew. But one thing was certain. All it took was the first rumor to emerge for the football world to start talking about him again. Social media exploded. Videos remembering his moments of glory began to circulate. Debates about his career were held again. Sports journalists began to discuss the real chances of a comeback. Would it be possible? Would he still be physically fit to play? Would he still have the motivation to withstand the intensity of professional football? Or was it all just another wave of nostalgia, fueled by the longing of fans who never fully accepted their downfall? Then came the first public appearance in a long time. He was there, surrounded by cameras, surrounded by curious eyes that tried to decipher any expression, any gesture, any clue that indicated a possible return. But as always, he gave nothing away. His enigmatic manner remained the same. Smiles here and there, short sentences, answers that revealed nothing. He knew everyone wanted confirmation, but he wouldn't give it. Not yet. Because if there was one thing he'd learned over the years, it was that mystery had always been one of his greatest weapons. The days passed, and the silence returned. No official announcement, no concrete movement that indicated he would actually play again. But football didn't wait. Clubs began to be asked if they would be interested in signing him. Coaches were asked if they would accept giving a chance to a player with a story. Former players began to give their opinions on what he should do. "If I were him, I'd go back," said a former teammate. "But to really play, not just to appear in the media," added another. And so, the pressure started to build. The public was divided. Some wanted to see him back at any cost. It didn't matter the shape, it didn't matter the age, it didn't matter if he wasn't the same as before. They just wanted to see him on the field again, if only for one last game, one last moment to remember why he was once called Emperor. But others thought this idea was a mistake. He's already lost his chance, they said. Football is not a forgiving sport. If he wanted to, he would have come back a long time ago. And in the midst of this debate, only he knew the truth. Until, suddenly, a new clue appeared. A football businessman revealed that he had been approached by a club. No one knew exactly which, but speculation began to grow. A Brazilian team? Any minor leagues abroad? A symbolic contract, just for a dignified farewell? No concrete answer, but the possibility was now real. And then, when everyone was used to the uncertainty, came the revelation that no one expected. Something that would take everyone by surprise and completely change the way their story would be remembered. If you thought this journey had already come to an end, get ready. Because the next chapter is the most unbelievable of all. If you haven't left your like yet, enjoy it now and click the button. Football is a relentless cycle. Players emerge, shine, and disappear. Some leave an eternal legacy, others fall into oblivion. But there are those who, even after the fall, still try to come back. Adriano Imperator was one of them. His story seemed to have come to an end. He was no longer a star, no longer an elite player. But just when everyone thought he would never step on the field again, a final chapter emerged. After years of indiscipline, injuries, and withdrawal from the sport, Adriano received a new chance. It wasn't a big contract in Europe, nor a $1 million offer from a team in Brazil, but it was an opportunity to do something that many already thought impossible: play professional football again. But this comeback attempt was much more than a simple contract. It was his last chance to prove he was still a football player, that he still had something to offer, that the Emperor could still reign, if only for one more day. The return to football. Hope or illusion? After so many back and forth, so many failed attempts, Adriano decided to accept an offer from a smaller team in Brazil. It wasn't a Flamengo, a Corinthians, or a Sao Paulo. It was a club without much expression, a modest project, but it represented a new opportunity to show that there was still something within it. The news took everyone by surprise. The sports media was in shock. How was it possible that, after so many controversies, Adriano still wanted to try playing again? Was he really ready to dedicate himself? Or would it be just another attempt without commitment, like so many others before? The first images of Adriano training with the new team immediately went viral. Cameras followed his every movement. Curious fans showed up to see him on the field. What everyone wanted to know was simple. Was he still capable of playing football? And the answer was ambiguous. On the one hand, the talent was still there. The power of his shot was still impressive. His vision of the game was still different. But on the other hand, time had taken a heavy toll. His physique was no longer the same. His speed no longer existed as it once did. The Adriano who returned to football was a different player from the one who once dominated Europe. In the first training open to the public, Adriano arrived smiling, joking with his teammates. He looked happy, but it only took a few minutes for the harsh reality to set in. He tried to keep up with the training pace, but quickly showed signs of fatigue. The intensity of professional football was no longer something he could sustain. The fans who went to watch the training noticed that he was far from ideal. His touches on the ball were still accurate, but his movement was slow. He could still finish with strength, but he no longer had the explosiveness to compete in quick shots. That was no longer the same destruction machine that terrorized defenders in Italy. But even so, Adriano continued. He knew that many doubted him. I knew that, for the majority. This return was just another attempt doomed to failure. But he wanted to try. He would at least like to have the chance to decide for himself when to hang up his boots. When opening day finally arrived, the stadium was full. Not because the team had a big fan base, but because everyone wanted to see Adriano on the field again. They wanted to see if he could still show a glimpse of the emperor who once enchanted the world. The coach decided to use him for a few minutes in the second half. When he entered the field, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. It was an exciting moment. Adriano, who once dominated Europe, now played in a much smaller stadium, without all the grandeur that had once been part of his life. But for him, that moment still meant a lot. In the first minutes, he tried to touch the ball, move, look for the game, but his physical condition quickly took its toll. He was visibly out of rhythm. He couldn't keep up with his opponent's speed. When the ball arrived, he still tried to do something different, but his reaction was slow. Time had caught up with him, and he could no longer fight it. The following games were even worse. His playing time was decreasing. The coach realized he couldn't count on him as a starter. Adriano was just a presence in the squad, a name on the bench, a shadow of what he once was. The media was unforgiving. Criticism began to emerge quickly. They said he wasn't physically prepared, that his return was just a marketing ploy rather than a real attempt to revive his career. They said he no longer had any commitment, that his mentality was still the same as it was years ago when he began to lose interest in the sport. But this time, something was different. He didn't walk away, he didn't abandon the project, he didn't escape the demands. He stayed, he tried. But football does not forgive time. The minutes on the field were decreasing. The coach realized that he could no longer keep up with the pace of the games. Little by little, he was placed on the bench, appearing only in the final minutes of less important matches. The great story of redemption that many expected never came to fruition. Football had been merciless to Adriano and was now making it clear that there was no longer any room for his return. The farewell came silently. No big press conference, no exciting announcements. Just confirmation that he would no longer play. And this time, there was no doubt that it was definitive. His time had passed. And while other players who started their careers with him continued to shine, winning titles and leaving a legacy in the sport, Adriano just moved away once again. The emperor who once dominated football was now just a distant memory. His name was still mentioned, but no longer as an active star. His trajectory became a reference in discussions about wasted talent, about how football can be ruthless towards those who cannot stay at the top. But his story wasn't over yet, because even away from the field, his name would still be discussed again in a way that no one could have predicted. If you thought this journey had already come to an end, wait until you see what happened next. 12. The story could have ended there. Adriano had tried, resisted for a while, but football showed, once again, that it waits for no one. When he realized there was no more room for his return, The fans, who were initially filled with hope, now accepted reality. His time had passed. There would no longer be one last great performance. There would no longer be a memorable goal to end his career with a flourish. The player who had once been one of the most feared strikers in the world was now just a memory, a name that aroused nostalgia and a bitter taste of something unfinished. But his story would not end there, because even away from football, Adriano would still be a topic of conversation again in a way that no one could have predicted. Away from the pitch, he began to live a completely different reality. While many former players continued in football as commentators, coaches, or business people, Adriano chose the opposite path. He no longer wanted the routine of sport. He no longer wanted to be involved in the world that once applauded him and then turned its back on him. He made a point of walking away. He disappeared from the sports news, avoided interviews, and refused any invitation that would bring him back into the spotlight. It was as if he wanted to erase any trace of the player he once was. But football doesn't forget so easily. From time to time, his name returned to the headlines, not for feats on the field, but for events that left his former fans perplexed. Photographs were leaked, showing a life completely different from what everyone expected from a former elite athlete. He no longer looked anything like the emperor who dominated Europe. He no longer displayed the attitude of a player who marked generations. His former colleagues continued to participate in sporting events, being honored, and having their careers celebrated. Adriano, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant from this universe, immersed in a lifestyle that contrasted with everything he once represented. The press tried to understand what had happened. How did someone who had everything decide to give it all up? How did a player who could have been a legend choose to become just a fuzzy football memory? But the more intriguing question was he happy? Has he truly found peace away from the sport that made him an idol? The answers never came clearly. He always avoided talking openly about his past, dodged questions about regret, and left the question in the air as to whether, at any point, he felt he could have done differently. Fans, who were initially outraged by his fall, began to see him differently. Many began to respect his choice, to accept that not everyone was made for the pressure of football, for the incessant demand that the sport demands. But at the same time, it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Because as much as he insisted he was fine, the images that emerged from time to time seemed to tell a different story. Empty looks, tired expressions, sporadic appearances that generated more questions than answers. Then came the moment that no one expected. Something that took the football world by surprise and brought his name back into the spotlight in a completely different way. An episode that made everyone wonder if the story had really come to an end or if there was still one last chapter to be written. And that moment happened when images of him began to circulate again on the internet. But this time they weren't photos of parties or a life far from football. He was seen in a stadium watching a game, surrounded by former teammates and sports officials. Speculation was immediate. Could he be planning a return, perhaps not as a player, but as an important behind-the-scenes cog? Would you be involved in a sports project? Some journalists even stated that he could take on a role within a club, helping to train new generations of players, perhaps even as an ambassador for the sport. But once again, he remained silent. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny, he just appeared and let the football world create its own theories. But what came next was even more unexpected. In a rare interview, Adriano spoke openly about his relationship with football. For the first time, he admitted that he missed his playing days, that he had never found anything that completely replaced the feeling of being on the field, hearing the fans shout his name. But at the same time, he made it clear that he did not regret his choices. For him, everything happened as it should. That moment was enough to reignite the entire discussion about his career. Old videos exploded on the internet, remembering their best moments. Experts have begun to debate again whether he should have been one of the greatest of all time. The public, divided between those who saw him as a wasted talent and those who saw him as a player who just followed the path he wanted, made his name relevant once again. What became clear in this episode is that, even away from the field, Adriano Imperator will never be forgotten. His talent was real. His plays, his goals, his presence on the field, all of this still lives in the fans' memories. But now, I want to know your opinion. Do you think Adriano was wronged by football, or did he destroy his career with his own choices? If he had dedicated himself more, would he have been a sporting legend? Comment below, I want to know what you think. And if you found this story unbelievable, wait until you meet the player who had everything it took to be a legend, but saw his career destroyed in an even more tragic way. What happened to him is simply unforgiven. Click now on the video that is appearing on the screen and get ready for the most shocking story that football has ever tried to hide.